Chapter 4. Buenos Aires. If the weather in England was cold, it was the opposite in Buenos Aires. The deep-seated heat was omnipresent, a buffer of warm air insulating against any other feelings. When the sun finally disappeared into the night sky, it left a clear, starlit night, but hardly any relief from the daytime temperatures, and settled at a steady 30 degrees. The British Embassy in BA was a beautiful Edwardian building, in its own grounds on Dr. Louis Agatis Street, in the Recoleta area of the city, commanding views across the nearby parks and squares in one of the most elegant parts of the city. The Recoleta, as it was referred to by all visitors, housed some of the most beautiful and culturally rich buildings in BA. The art galleries and museums surrounded the radial streets leading out from the central square and the famous Recoleta Cemetery, which was a major tourist attraction. It was comprised of wide open spaces and streets and, unlike other areas of the city, was safe for tourists day and night. Having been held under Swiss control with no direct contact since the Falklands conflict, the newly opened embassy had just held a reception with a view to fostering new relations within the capital. They had hoped to encourage an entente cordiale with, amongst others, their counterparts in a Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores y Culto, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Worship. The MREC had recently opened its doors and was deliberately courting the British, which, in turn, had given them cause for suspicion and concern, whilst openly welcoming the overtures of the government ministry with open political and diplomatic arms. Andrew Waddington and Valentina Perez stepped out of the gates of the British Embassy onto Dr. Louis Agatis Street, arm in arm, and were embraced by the warm air currents swirling around the park opposite. Although 10 p.m, the streets were still busy with careful tourists and local people out for an evening stroll. The sweet smell of dusty streets, fragrant jasmine and plumbago mingled in the air to create a heady cocktail of scents. They had met a few weeks ago at a formal reception, when Waddington had visited the newly finished MREC building on Esmeralda 1212, some distance away to the east of the city, close to the Bay Area and the park of Plaza San Martin. The reception had been perfunctory, a courteous, political, tightly formed affair, carefully and diplomatically sweeping under the carpet both the conflict of '82 and the subsequent repercussions. The fact that MREC was also responsible for the Foreign Office and certain elements of the Argentine Internal Secret Service was not entirely lost on the British contingent. Valentina had been there in a semi-official capacity, adding colour and sparkle. Like so many of the well-bred Argentine women, she was tall and slim, with dark blonde hair, bespeaking lineage of foreign ancestry. Many Argentines had married Irish immigrants from the early 1800s, with long legs, a cafe au lait skin, and slightly slanting, almost oriental brown eyes. Andrew had been immediately attracted to her, and as the feeling was obviously mutual, he felt that she could be useful to him and was therefore combining business with pleasure. Waddington was slightly taller than Valentina, and as they sauntered down the street, he extended his possession with a carefully placed arm around her waist. "Well, that was very tame, formal and safe," he commented, laughing with her. "I know," she replied huskily in a strong Argentine accent, accentuating the S's in her English pronunciation. "Let's go somewhere more exciting and real." "I'm all yours. You're the local guide," he shrugged submission. A taxi was hailed, and during the journey she described how the real BA was locked in the barrio, La Boca, and the raw tango clubs and the bars of the area. It was, she persuaded him, where the real locals went to enjoy themselves. Andrew, for his part, knew the dangers of this barrio. It was by turns very safe and extremely dangerous, like so many of the areas of big cities the world over. One street to the next changed everything. The brightly coloured buildings of the barrio were famous, and by day a magnetic tourist attraction, but by night it was a different story. However, he was no innocent abroad, and his MI6 training left him in no doubts about what to expect and how to deal with it. He need not have worried. The taxi dropped them in the Avenue Don Pedro de Mendoza, close to the waterfront, and a thriving club, Carminto, where Valentina assured him he would see the best tango dancing ever. Upon entering through the bright red doors, their senses were assailed by the thick atmosphere of smoke, raunchy music, heavy sickly perfume, and sweet sweat, mingling to create an exotic mix. They managed to get a table close to the floor show, with Valentina exerting some sublime influence of sex and charm with the manager, where it was evident that she was known. After some good dances, Valentina squeezed his hand and whispered, "Watch this now." The spotlight emerged from the subdued lighting, highlighting an extraordinary performance from a slick, sexy couple playing every move to the haunting brassy notes of the band. Their interpretation was mesmerizing and had everyone entranced. The applause at the end of their display was rapturous, and an encore ensued. 2 hours had passed since they entered the club, and they decided to leave. The bill was paid, and they moved through the crowd and out onto the street. A combination of the night air with brandy on top of the champagne from the reception seemed to hit Valentina quite quickly, as she staggered and sighed, slightly leaning into Waddington's arm for balance. As she did so, Andrew momentarily lost his balance in an effort to support her, stepping out with his left leg off the curb and straightening his shoulders against the extra weight. The Mitsubishi Montero, cruising slowly and inconspicuously some 50 yards further down the street, accelerated fast, spinning the wheels in a burn of rubber, despite the four-wheel drive and the heavy weight of the car. Alerted by the sound, Andrew just had time to twist his neck, glancing over his right shoulder to see the vehicle bearing down upon him. What caused alarm and a split second of frozen fear was the partially open door scything across the pavement as the Mitsubishi closed in upon him. The sound of steel against flesh was audible as a sickening thud. The car caught Waddington on the exposed hip of his straddled leg. He collapsed with the force and was quickly caught a second time by the partially open door, spinning his shoulder, driving his head to the pavement, where it bounced viciously up, back down, and was still. Blood seeped from the crack in his skull, and Valentina, caught by the fall, was on her knees beside him to support his head, screaming at the top of her voice in a manic wail. The car screamed off and turned down the next street, disappearing from view. Onlookers and other pedestrians rushed forward in shock at the scene. 1 or 2 ran into the nearest bars to demand phones to call an ambulance. Valentina continued screaming in shock, which had turned to a mewing sound as Waddington bled out onto the pavement, staining it a dark red. Some minutes later an ambulance arrived. It was only a short distance from the hospital, Pioscostensia Jose de Bercaboda, to the northwest of the barrio. The ambulance men carefully strapped the prostrate form of Waddington onto the stretcher, lifted him carefully into the ambulance, then sped away, sirens and lights flashing. Valentina had not been allowed to accompany him, and was left distraught in tears on the pavement. Someone hailed a cab for her, and she was carried away. She gave instructions to the driver for the residential address of her apartment. Bursting into her apartment some 15 minutes later, she ran to the telephone, dialed a number, and ranted in staccato Spanish when it was answered at the other end. "But," she screamed, "you weren't supposed to kill him." "He's dead? Ah, well, the fortunes of war. Now listen, pull yourself together. Do the expected thing, call the embassy, tell them what has happened, cry, be upset, just as you are, and do it now." The voice commanded, and the call was terminated. She sobbed as the line was cut, a mixture of fear, anger, and genuine compassion for Andrew. It was never meant to get this serious. But what was she to expect working for the government? They were ruthless and fanatical. She dialed a number for the British Embassy and burst into tears halfway through a conversation with one of the embassy secretaries on night duty. Details were taken, the call finished with a promise to keep her informed of any funeral arrangements. Alarm bells rang in the embassy, night staff were put on alert. The ambassador, Humphrey Maude, and squadron leader Dorset were notified. People left warm beds and rushed in. Waddington's partner, an MI6 operative, appeared in the briefing room, dishevelled, with an angry and determined look on her face. Sophie Carswell was of medium height and build, athletic but not masculine. Her open looks were neither striking nor plain, but could be made up to be either as the case required. She was a perfect 6 operative. She and Andrew had been a good team, and she wanted answers and revenge in that order. "What do we know?" she demanded, taking a seat opposite the ambassador. "We have checked with the Jose Tiburcio hospital, and despite what his companion thought, he's not dead. He has a broken hip, smashed shoulder, and bleeding on the brain. They have relieved the pressure on the skull and are keeping him in an induced coma to see how he responds. He could still die, but the next 24 hours are apparently crucial. The staff are very good at Jose, and they see a lot of street violence at the A&E. He's in good hands. We have placed a discreet security presence outside his room, and he is being monitored around the clock." Dorset spoke in clipped, unemotional tones. Carswell demanded, "Who was with him? That bloody woman from the MRC? You know he was getting close. This is how they shut him down. But try to kill or try to, isn't that going to just a little too far for a friendly nation? I need to report this back to 6HQ. She turned to leave, furious and upset. Andrew was a good friend. As she turned, Dorset's voice called her back. "Sophie, we don't know for certain it was a set-up. It could just be a coincidence. The Loboka can be a dangerous place. The driving here is erratic. You of all people know that. We cannot just assume he was targeted to be killed." "No. Do you think that is just a little bit of a coincidence?" she responded sarcastically, motioning with finger and thumb a fraction of an inch apart. "That this should happen just now, just when the intelligence was starting to flow? Surely this proves we are correct in our suspicions. Somehow, he must have had his cover blown. He was due to head up north to Corrientes with her this weekend on a summer trip to see the Iguazu Falls. Just coincidence they happened to pass a major military base on the way. They know. They're on to us, or at least Andrew, so no more embassy staff, no more replacements. They're easily spotted. Make your report, I'll make mine. Another solution needs to be found, and quickly." She stormed out as politely and politically etiquette demanded. Dorset and Maud exchanged glances, both silently agreeing with each other. She has a point. As upset as she obviously is, a valid one. I believe the FO will now take this seriously, but how exactly are we to proceed given the constraints so delicately outlined by Sophie? I'm not entirely certain, Maud finished. "Oh, I believe there are already contingency plans in place for this eventuality, and I, for one, do not intend to be the second military attaché with egg on his face for not ensuring a stern enough warning was received and acted upon." Maud raised an eyebrow in acknowledgement of the cryptic remark, referring to a previous MA who'd been forced to resign over just such an issue and made his leave to file a report back to his superiors in London.